What's the creepiest, most blood-chilling thing you have ever experienced? Story 1. When I was 16, my parents went out of town for a weekend. It was actually pretty sweet because I got to be king of the castle for the weekend. So I get home that Friday night and just mess around with the internet and video games and start watching television around dusk. The way our living room was set up was that there was a set of glass doors right next to the television that looked out to the back porch and backyard. The backyard was surrounded by ivy that grew on a hill around a 45-degree angle. So I am just mindlessly channel surfing, and I see some movement outside. At first I just dismiss it, thinking it is a bird or a neighborhood cat or something. But I then notice that whatever is moving is way bigger than a bird or a cat. I go and put my face near the glass and stare into the backyard, and there is some guy just crouching in the ivy looking into the house. Our eyes meet, and he has somewhat of an oh no moment and bolts out of our yard. Story 2. So this happened senior year of high school. My best friend and I were at her house, which was way up in one of the canyons, and she had a long, winding driveway. We had been there all day, and her mom had gone out, and she and I were supposed to go meet a couple friends in Hollywood that night. Anyways, we had been goofing around all day and watching scary movies and whatnot, and we started to get ready. Her bathroom had one of those his and her double sink setups, so she was near one, and I was at the other. All of a sudden, I got the creepiest feeling, like all of the hair on my arms stood up, and I had this sudden feeling of panic. To this day, it is the most terrified I have ever been. I was putting on eyeliner when it happened, and I caught her eye in the mirror and said that we needed to leave right now. I thought she would be like, "What are you talking about?" or that I was being ridiculous. But instead, she said that she knew. My blood ran cold when she said it. We left so quickly that we just grabbed what was in front of us. We ran out of her house and down the driveway, which we were not supposed to be on because her mom had just had it repaved, and her car was parked down on the street. We rounded the curve in the driveway, and there was a sport utility vehicle parked dead center in the middle of the street without its lights on. Suddenly, the lights turned on full blast. The vehicle blared its horn and took off. We scrambled the rest of the way down, completely ruining the new paving, and were getting into her car and calling the police when her mom pulled up right behind us. To this day, I do not know if it was a robber or something else, but the fact that she and I both got the sense of dread at the exact same time creeps me out endlessly. Story 3. My mom had a stalker for years. She was maybe in her early 30s, I was about 3, and my brother was around 1 when this started. My dad would leave for work in the morning, and as soon as he was gone, the calls would start coming in. She would answer the phone, and some man would be saying all these horribly sadistic and explicit things about what he wanted to do to my mom. She was beyond frightened and did not know what to do. Sometimes the caller would describe what she was wearing at that very minute or describe what she was doing. My parents were struggling financially, so they could not just pack up and move. But my mom started spending more and more time at my dad's mother's house when he was away. The police got involved, but they could not trace the call. Finally, they were able to save up enough money to move, and I was about 6 by this time. The phone number was changed and unlisted in the phone book. This was around 1988 when everyone still used landline telephones. My mom never got another scary phone call, but she had nightmares about it for years. When I was little, I remember going into her bedroom in the morning, and she would be sobbing into her pillow. I did not understand it at that point, but she explained later in life that she would wake up from a nightmare and just shake and cry. A couple months after we had moved, the police informed us that they finally caught the man. It was our next-door neighbor's 19-year-old son. He had been in the military but was discharged due to severe mental illness. I guess he was put into some sort of special security home that specializes in mental health. The lead investigator said that the son was obsessed with my mother, and they found a box in his room full of photographs candidly taken of her when she was out in the garden or playing with us kids in the yard. It chills me to the bone when I think about it now, because anything could have happened to my mother when my dad was at work, and I would have been too young to help her. Story 4. When my friend's dad was around 17 years old, he decided to go camping with about 8 or so of his friends. This took place in the Wisconsin forest. When they got to the site, they decided to split up to collect firewood in groups of 2 and meet back at the campsite in around 20 minutes. One group was not back right away, and since they were a couple, they just assumed they were being intimate somewhere in the bushes and cracked a few jokes about it. After around an hour, they decided they should probably go look for them and headed off to search in the area where they had been collecting wood. They saw behind a bush part of the girl's bloody shirt, and the man's shoes were lying scattered around the scene. They quickly rushed back to their car so they could drive to the park ranger's office, which was about 5 miles away, and report the incident. However, they found that their gas had been siphoned, so they had no choice but to walk. While walking back to the office, they saw a semi-truck pass by with one driver and two faces pressed up against the window, which they believed were their friends begging for help. The two friends were reported missing and have never been found to this day. Story 5. We had a break-in at the home I lived in as a child. I was about 5 years old and I used to come home from school alone, as my sister was still at school and my parents were at work. The house was at the bottom of a long driveway with a very large yard and a huge bush with a river behind it, so it was quite isolated. One day I came home from school, walked down the driveway as usual, went to unlock the gate, and noticed that our front door was broken, but the gate was not. As I said, I was only 5, so I was not very smart, and I proceeded to open the gate to go inside. As I entered, I heard one or more people running out the back door. I went into the house and saw that the burglars had broken in through a back window and taken almost everything. The point of the story is that they were still in the house when I arrived home, and when they heard the front gate opening, they fled out the back, probably thinking it was my dad, who was a police officer. Had they known it was just a 5-year-old child, who knows what could have happened to me? It makes my blood run cold just thinking about it. Story 6. When I was 26 and 6 months pregnant, I went to my dad's house to pick up his mail. My dad was working overseas, but my older and more irresponsible brother was still living there. I noticed his car was gone, so when I entered the house and heard movement in his room upstairs, I thought it was his girlfriend. As I was going through the mail, I noticed the movement upstairs had stopped, and I heard the floorboards creaking as if someone was trying not to be noticed. Something told me to hide, so I ran down the hall to my dad's room and saw that his window was broken and glass was scattered all over the floor. As I was realizing this, I heard the stairs creaking, so I ran into my dad's bathroom. From there, I had a clear view down the hall to the wall where the stair landing was, and I could see unfamiliar legs wearing long black basketball shorts and the bottom of a large red shirt standing there, slowly bending as if trying to quietly peek down the hall in order to escape back out of the house through the broken window. Thankfully, he took a chance and ran out of the front door. Luckily, I had not locked the front door behind me as I usually did, and I do not know what I would have done if I had been forced to confront him. It makes me sick to imagine the fear a child would feel in that situation. Even though I grew up in Southwest Houston, an area known for gang activity, especially among teenagers and young adults associated with street gangs like the Bloods, which would explain the red shirt, I had never had a negative experience before. After that day, I never went back to my dad's house without my husband or brother being there. Story 7. I was a big Pee Wee fan and loved it at first. In my room, I had bunk beds, and I slept on the bottom bunk, while on the top I kept all of my favorite toys and stuffed animals. I would often leave them in really strange formations after having battles and similar games. But I always remembered to leave certain ones in certain places because they were my favorites, especially my Ninja Turtles and Pee Wee. A few months after getting this toy, though, I started to have some truly terrible nightmares about it. Not the kind of mild, early 1990s children's nightmares like those from Are You Afraid of the Dark, but extremely graphic and horrifying dreams where someone had broken into our house and forced me to watch him hurt my sisters and my parents while the doll just laughed. It was deeply scarring. I told my parents and they immediately got rid of it, which apparently just meant they hid it in the garage since I could not see the thing stored up high anyway. A couple of weeks later, I woke up and all my Ninja Turtles were on the floor, which was confusing, but I figured maybe I had shaken the bed in my sleep. A few days after that, my older sister woke my parents up screaming about a dream she had just had, and it was nearly identical to the dream I had told them about, even though I know she had never heard it. My parents realized this too, and my mother looked genuinely horrified. I got yelled at for supposedly telling my sister such awful things, but once it became clear that I really had not told her, my mom looked even more worried. I watched her go into the garage, grab Pee Wee, put him in a trash bag, and throw him into the dumpster. For years after that, I would wake up and my stuffed animals would be in very strange places. Places I knew I had not left them and never would have. I became obsessed. When I was 12, I found the Pee-wee toy in a box in the garage. My mom said my dad must have come home, seen it in the trash, and pulled it out. But he does not remember ever doing that. He swears he did not even know she threw it away, let alone went looking for it. Story 8. I used to take care of a developmentally disabled man in a community protection program. He had to be kept away from people because of sudden violent outbursts. His parents were wealthy and bought an old farmhouse on about 10 acres, roughly 4 miles out of town, so that he could be away from the public and not forced into a psychiatric ward. For 4 years, I worked there on a 56-hour shift, coming in on Sunday evening and leaving Wednesday afternoon. There were two of us assigned to these shifts, and we were both supposed to be there the entire 56 hours. But because we were the most senior trainers on staff, we would take turns going home on 1 or 2 of the nights. After 3 years in that house, I had become comfortable with it, despite how isolated and generally unsettling it was. I would always stay up watching television until around midnight, since my client was always locked in his room around 8 in the evening. One night at about 12:15 ante meridiem, I turned the television off and pulled the covers over myself to try to sleep on the worst futon imaginable. There was one window in the staff room, facing the back of the property, about 6 feet off the ground. I had just started drifting off when I heard the most blood-curdling woman scream coming from right outside the window. I jumped up so fast I nearly blacked out and had to steady myself in the doorway, while the scream continued and then faded away. I grabbed a flashlight from the laundry room, threw open the back door, and shined it around the area outside the window, but there was nothing there. I ran along the perimeter of the house and saw absolutely nothing. I stayed awake until the sun came up the next morning, glued to the television, trying to distract myself from what had happened. Everyone I worked with was much older than me, and there was no reason anyone would play a prank like that in the middle of January in Eastern Oregon. I am sure there is an explanation, but it still bothers me to this day. Story 9. On April 18th of this year, I came home from work and started doing some homework. After about 30 minutes, my aunt entered my mother's bedroom and began screaming hysterically, ordering me to call 911. Once I was on the line with the emergency operator, she asked what the nature of my emergency was. I did not fully know, so I went into my mother's bedroom and found her deceased from a heart attack, lying face down on the floor, wedged between her nightstand and her bed. The operator dispatched paramedics and instructed me on how to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which required me to flip my mother onto her back. When I grabbed her cold, lifeless arm, I realized she could not be moved because she was firmly wedged between the bed and the nightstand, and rigor mortis had already set in. I was unable to turn her over, and I had never seen or touched a dead body before. After the paramedics arrived and told me that nothing could be done, the medical examiner informed my family that she could not be viewed because she had been lying face down for so long. My family assumed she hit her head as she fell, since her dentures were found on the floor beside her. The combination of the head injury and the many hours that had passed made her condition unsuitable for viewing, as explained by the officer from the medical examiner's office. The sight and the feeling of my mother's body remains the most chilling experience I have ever had. Story 10. I feel like this will get buried, but when I was in primary school, there was an older man who used to work on the playground. He would monitor the children and make sure everything was okay. He would often invite me over for dinner and talk about his wife who was supposedly at home waiting for him to return. He told me about his dogs and said I could give them treats if I ever met them. I used to beg my mother to let me go to his house, but she always refused without hesitation. I was disappointed because his home sounded fun, and I wanted to meet his dogs, but my mother's word was final, so I eventually let it go. Somehow he found out my address and sent me a Christmas card one year. Years later, when I was in secondary school, his name appeared all over the newspapers. He had been convicted of assaulting a 6-year-old girl. It also came out that his wife had actually passed away years earlier. I was only 8 years old when I knew him, but I still remember exactly what he looked like, and I will always be grateful that my mother was so protective of me. Story 11. When I was a freshman in high school, my cousin was deeply involved in Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps and the Army, and he had been accepted to West Point. Tragically, he was shot and killed during the winter of his senior year of high school and was buried in full Army service dress. The following summer, I attended encampment as part of Civil Air Patrol, which is similar to a week-long basic training for new cadets. During graduation, we were all standing on the parade field in the 90-degree Virginia summer heat when I suddenly felt ice cold. I looked across the field toward the bleachers where our parents were seated, and standing in front of them was a pale white figure in full Army service dress, clearly blocking the view of several people throughout the ceremony. No one else was standing, and no one asked him to sit, even though many people in uniform were seated. I watched the figure the entire time, and it stood completely still at parade rest for as long as I could see it. After the pass and review ended, and we returned to our positions on the field, the figure was gone. When the ceremony ended, I asked everyone in my flight if they had seen the figure, and they all said they had not noticed anyone like that. To this day, I am completely certain it was my cousin coming back one last time to see me graduate. Story 12. I was in Las Vegas last year with my brother, and we were both still in our 20s and enjoyed partying. While walking down the strip, I noticed two men wearing backpacks and immediately knew what that usually meant. I commented that I wished we had something to relax with, and they turned around right away and offered other things as well. We took one of their numbers in case we wanted more later that night. Several hours later, after a lot of drinking, we called the number again. The first time we met them, they were on foot, but the second time they told us to meet them in front of a hotel because they were driving and suggested we get in the vehicle briefly so no one would be watching. At that point, my brother and I were not thinking clearly and did not realize what was happening until it started getting dark. We had only been driving for about 10 minutes, but it was obvious we were far off the strip, away from the lights and people. The driver was speeding erratically with loud music playing, which made everything more disorienting. My brother finally asked where we were going, and they said we were heading to a liquor store quickly and would be dropped off afterward, even though it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. Once we fully realized how unsafe the situation was, we opened the doors while stopped at a light and ran toward the only place we could see, a gas station. A taxi drove by a few minutes later and stopped for us, even though the driver said it was not allowed, because it was obvious we needed help. After we explained what happened, he calmly told us that there were no liquor stores anywhere near that area. It was both the worst and best feeling at the same time, knowing how narrowly we avoided something terrible, and we stayed quiet for the rest of the night. Story 13. When my daughter was 3 years old, she stayed the night at a friend's house who had two little girls around the same age. All three children were asleep, and my friend was in her room watching the baby monitor. I received a call a little after 3 in the morning telling me I needed to come pick up my daughter. My friend explained that she had heard the bedroom door where the girls were sleeping open and close several times. And then all three girls suddenly began screaming at the exact same moment. My daughter had a bruise on her arm shaped like a handprint, about the size of an 8-year-old's hand, and there was no one present who could have caused it. All three girls described seeing an old woman with a monstrous face standing in the doorway, opening and closing the door, and said that a little girl was trying to wake my daughter because the old woman was going to hurt her. My daughter is 6 years old now and still talks about the experience. Afterward, my friend had paranormal investigators come to the house due to this and several other incidents, and they claimed there were 3 spirits on the property, one being an 8-year-old girl, one an elderly woman, and the third a very tall man. I have personally seen the girl and the man myself and experienced a few unexplained events there as well. Story 14. In college, I worked security for extra money, and one of my regular assignments was the overnight shift at a metal fabrication factory. One of the main reasons I was there was to make sure no one broke in to steal the valuable metal stored on site, which had been an issue before, and that meant checking the perimeter fence for damage at least once per shift. That could not be done properly using cameras, so it required physically walking the fence. One night, I was doing this during a thunderstorm, focused entirely on the beam of my flashlight, illuminating the fence as I walked, not really paying attention to where I was stepping, even though the grass was a bit higher than my waist. Apparently, I stepped awkwardly on a slick patch of mud or grass while heading downhill, and before I fully understood what was happening, I slid feet first into an open storm sewer. Someone had recently stolen the manhole cover, and the edges around the opening were wet and muddy from the storm. To explain the structure, It was shaped like an oubliette, essentially a concrete pit with a narrow opening at the top and inward sloping sides designed to prevent escape. The bottom was roughly 10 feet square, with the manhole opening about twice the normal width at the ceiling, no ladder attached, and a fall of around 20 feet. The floor sloped into trenches, forming a cross, with narrow sewer channels extending in four directions, blocked by metal grates. Scattered across the bottom were debris and several large broken pieces of rebar, some pointing straight upward. Had I hit the bottom, I would almost certainly have been severely injured or worse. Somehow, as I fell, I caught the edge of the opening with my elbow, though my flashlight dropped to the bottom first, giving me a clear view of the jagged metal below as I struggled. My phone slipped from my pocket and fell as well. It felt like an eternity before I managed to pull myself out, fueled by adrenaline and sheer panic. I nearly lost my grip several times, jerking my knees toward the opening and using momentum to inch upward, my free hand scraping uselessly against mud and concrete. I am still not sure how I managed to escape using only friction and instinct, but it felt nothing short of miraculous. Afterward, all I could think about was that I was not scheduled to be relieved for another 7 hours, and no one would have even started looking for me until then, while I could have been trapped or injured at the bottom of that pit in the rain. I also could not stop thinking about the person who stole that manhole cover and how close I had come to a very different outcome. Story 15. One night, I was alone during a storm and kept getting an intense, unsettling feeling that someone else was there. I went upstairs, opened the front door, locked the screen door, then shut, locked, and chained the main door, figuring that if anyone tried to get inside, they would make enough noise to give me time to react and call the police. That made me feel slightly better, but the feeling would not go away and only got worse. Eventually, it became so overwhelming that I did not even want to be in the house at all. I went to bed but could not sleep, and at some point I must have passed out from exhaustion. About an hour later, my mother woke me up asking why I had been outside in the storm walking around the yard. Confused, I went outside and found boot prints all around the house. Whoever it was had followed me as I moved from room to room and had stood still in front of the windows long enough for their footprints to sink into the mud. That same day, I installed vinyl curtains on all the windows so no one could see inside even with the lights on, added alarms to the windows, reinforced the doors, secured the sliding door, replaced my bedroom door with solid wood, strengthened the fence latch, and made sure there was a phone and something to defend myself with in every room. It cost a significant amount of money, but I refused to take chances. I still do not like to think about what could have happened if whoever it was had gotten inside, and I do not want to know who they were or why they were there. Since then, I trust my instincts and regularly check to make sure everything is exactly where it should be. Story 16. When I was younger, around 8 or 9 years old, I went to my best friend's house for a sleepover. Her parents had recently gone through a difficult divorce, and her mother thought it would help if she had friends stay over because she had been experiencing frequent night terrors, something I only learned about later. We will call her Elle. There were about 6 of us sleeping in Elle's attic that night, and after eating junk food and talking for hours, we finally decided to sleep around 3 in the morning. Right before settling down, Elle explained that her parents divorced because her father had an affair, her mother changed the locks, and she was afraid he might show up because of how loudly he used to yell. We all tried to comfort her and make her feel safe before going to bed. I am usually the last one to fall asleep, and as I was drifting off, I felt someone nudging my shoulder and asking if I was okay. With my eyes still closed, I said I was fine, and the person told me not to sleep because they could not sleep. When I opened my eyes, I saw Elle standing over me with her eyes closed. I told her she looked like she was already asleep and suggested she go back to bed. She nudged my shoulder again, began crying loudly, then walked back to her side of the attic and lay down, immediately going silent. No one else woke up. I stayed frozen, watching and waiting, and eventually walked toward her side to check on her. But when I looked out the window, I saw a man standing by a tree in their front yard, dressed in black and completely still, as if waiting. I never made it to her bed and instead rushed back to my spot, sitting there awake until morning. Elle had no memory of what happened. Her mother denied anything unusual, and I felt like I was losing my mind until my mother later explained Elle's night terrors to me. When I mentioned the man outside, my mother was visibly shaken, and we assumed it could have been Elle's father, though we will never know for sure. Story 17, I saw an alien, and I am not joking. To this day, I still wonder if I somehow reacted to something I ate by accident or if my mind played a trick on me. But I know what I saw. I was about 10 years old and was playing alone in my room at around 11 in the evening. I had a sliding glass door in my room, and the blinds were pulled back. Out of nowhere, the automatic spotlight behind my house turned on. I looked toward the door and saw a figure approaching. At first, I thought it was my neighbor, who was older than me and about the same height. But as it got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It approached the door slowly and stopped right in front of the glass, staring directly at me. It felt like an eternity, even though in reality it was probably only a few seconds. I remember it being completely dark, almost black, with a rounded head like you see in movies, about 6 feet tall, with 2 arms and 2 legs, extremely thin. It was so close on the other side of the glass that there was absolutely no way I could have mistaken it for a human. After staring at me, it simply turned to the side and walked away in long, calm strides until it disappeared from view. I immediately ran out of my room screaming for my mother, but she did not believe me. I had to sleep in that room that night knowing something had been only a few feet away from me earlier. I am 23 now, and I still get chills when I think about it, my eyes watering every time the memory comes back. I know it was not a dream. I know what I saw, even though no one believes me. What scares me the most was its demeanor, the way it approached slowly and left just as calmly, as if there was no urgency at all, like it was simply observing me. I do not even believe in aliens visiting Earth, which makes it even harder to cope with. If what I saw really was some kind of alien, it resembled what people call a gray, except it was black. I am definitely not sleeping tonight. Story 18. This was not necessarily paranormal, but it deeply disturbed me and still makes my blood run cold. At the time, I was working at a crematory and funeral home. I had just picked up the body of a girl my own age from the county coroner's office and was going through the standard intake process, which involved extensive paperwork, fingerprinting, and documenting personal belongings. When a body comes from the coroner, it is usually due to an unexpected death under questionable circumstances, and I could tell just by looking at her that this was a drug overdose. She had obvious injection sites on her arms, her thigh, one on her foot, and what looked like needle marks all over her lower abdomen. It was alarming because that is not a typical injection site, especially given her body type, and it is also not where fluids are normally drawn during an autopsy. I tried to push the discomfort aside and continued documenting her belongings, which are usually placed in a black bag inside the body bag. Typically, the coroner's office provides a detailed inventory list, but in this case there was none, which already felt strange. I noticed a property bag tucked under her leg, opened it, and instead of shoes or clothing, a fully developed, greenish, deceased infant with a severely misshapen head fell out. The shock was indescribable. The family had no idea, and informing them was traumatic. There was no documentation for the infant, and even the coroner's office was stunned. It turned out an autopsy technician had placed the infant in the bag hoping it would be cremated without anyone noticing, to avoid additional paperwork and the burden of informing an already grieving family. A full investigation followed, including an autopsy on the infant and interviews with family and friends. Later, a friend revealed that the woman had confided she was pregnant and had planned to attempt a late-stage abortion by injecting heroin directly into her womb. After that experience, I was always uneasy opening property bags, afraid of finding something far more horrifying than personal belongings. Story 19. When I was young enough to still be in a crib, my room and my parents' room were mirror images of each other, separated by a wall. When I got older, I moved upstairs and that wall was knocked down to create a true master bedroom, and my dress clothes were stored in the closet that had once been in my room. For some reason, every time I went in there to look for something, my heart would start racing and I would feel terrified for no clear reason, rushing out as fast as I could. When I tried to understand why it made me feel that way, I would get this vivid image in my head of standing in the dark, staring at the closet while fire danced around the room. One day my mom noticed how shaken I was coming out of her room and asked what was wrong. When I explained it, the color drained from her face, and she asked me if I remembered. I had no idea what she meant, so she told me that when I was still in the crib, I would wake my parents crying almost every night, saying there was a man in the closet and that he wanted us to leave. After weeks of this, she started asking me questions, and when she asked his name, I told her it was Bill. That terrified her, because before we moved in, the house had belonged to her great-uncle Bill. When he was elderly, he had a live-in assistant who turned out to be a burglar robbing houses in the neighborhood. And when Bill started to realize it, the man tied him to the bed, robbed the house, and set it on fire before fleeing. He was eventually caught, but Bill burned to death. After hearing the name, my mom said she spoke out loud, telling Uncle Bill that we lived there now, that I was her son, that he was scaring me, and that we would take good care of the house, and asked him to leave us alone. After that, I slept through the night without any problems, and that was the last time anyone mentioned the man in the closet. Story 20. This did not happen directly to me, but it remains one of the most unsettling events in my family. I was 10 years old and my brother was 7, and at the time we shared a room with bunk beds in a 3-bedroom, 2-story apartment. One night my mother was sitting on the front porch reading when my younger brother suddenly ran up to the front door, soaking wet and wearing only his underwear. The front door was the only possible exit and it was locked and deadbolted. He was too small to unlock the ground floor windows. My mother was facing the sliding glass doors the entire time, and no one came through them, and the only accessible second-story windows were locked from the inside. Moments after he appeared, a college-age man rode up on a bicycle and explained that he had been riding home from work when he saw my brother standing in the sprinklers at the elementary school next to our apartment complex. When he called out to him, my brother hesitated for a moment and then ran back home. According to my father, there was absolutely no way my brother could have unlocked the deadbolt, as my dad had been working on a bookshelf directly in front of the door from the moment we were put to bed until my brother appeared. The only things my brother remembers from that night are going to sleep, seeing a bright light, and waking up at the school. The event itself is disturbing, but what truly unsettles me is knowing that anyone could have found him, and we were incredibly lucky it was a normal, concerned person. Story 21. 2 years ago, I was working deep in the Louisiana woods very late at night, around 2 in the morning, alone at an oil field location while loading equipment. There were no lights except the red glow from my trailer. I was miles from anyone, at the bottom of a hill with no cell service, and dispatch was unavailable. Halfway through the load, completely out of nowhere, I felt a spine-tingling chill run up my neck, and every hair on my arms and neck stood straight up, something I had never experienced before. My eyes widened, my focus sharpened, and I was overwhelmed by an intense feeling that I was being watched. I stayed completely still, except for frantically sweeping my flashlight across the top of my trailer, the tanks, and behind them. I suddenly felt a powerful urge to leave immediately, cut the load short, unhooked, ran back to my truck, and drove away as fast as I could. At 8 in the morning, I woke up to a message from the worker who pumped the location, showing a photograph taken behind the tank battery, about 20 feet from where I had been standing. In the clay were enormous cat paw prints, nearly the size of my hand, showing where the animal had been pacing back and forth behind the tanks watching me. That alone was terrifying, but what truly disturbed me was how I knew something was there before I ever saw proof. Something ancient and instinctive had activated, passed down through generations, alerting my body to a predator without any conscious thought. In that moment, I was reminded that I am still an animal, and my body knew it long before my mind did. Story 22. Some years back, my mom went on vacation with a friend to Florida, or somewhere similar, for about a week and a half during the winter, leaving me home alone, and I took advantage of it by setting up my game consoles on the big living room television. One night it was snowing, and throughout the evening I felt deeply uncomfortable. To be fair, it was day 6 out of 11, and I had never been alone in the house that long before, so I assumed it was just loneliness. The snow stopped sometime during the night, and I fell asleep on the couch around 2 in the morning. The next morning, snowplows came down the street and cleared everything as usual. I left the house to go pick up a few things from the store down the street, but I stopped almost immediately after stepping off my porch. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the large bay window on the side of the house, with a clear set approaching and another set leading away. The ones approaching were slightly filled in from snowfall, but there were two footprints positioned right next to the far corner of the window, close to the rear porch in some large bushes that were sharply defined and pointed directly toward the wall. Someone had been standing outside that window for a while, staring into my house, and had left when the snow stopped. The tracks started and ended at the street, but where they came from and where they went afterward had been erased by the plows. Since then, I bought large tint sheets to cover that window, hung thick dark curtains, and rearranged furniture to block the lower third of the glass completely. I never want to experience that again. And even as a 31-year-old man, the thought of someone silently watching me through my window fills me with the same tense, anxious terror I felt when I once nearly fell off a 15-foot cliff. I cannot sit near windows at night anymore without fully closing the curtains. Story 23. On a recent backroad camping trip, my friend and I were sitting by our fire cooking food and talking when the wind picked up as darkness fell, causing the trees to creak, and we heard a wolf howl in the distance. I asked him if he heard it, and he had. Normally, wolves do not concern me much, but this time I had my dog with me, and wolves where I live have been known to kill campers' dogs. A few minutes passed and we heard another howl, clearer and closer. We started building the fire higher. I grabbed my tomahawk, he picked up his machete, and we agreed that if we heard another howl, we would head straight for the truck and secure my dog. Sure enough, we heard another howl, even closer, so we stood up and started moving toward the vehicle. As we reached about halfway, my dog stopped to grab a stick, and as I turned around, I heard another howl roughly 20 feet away. I called my dog and we sprinted to the truck, getting him inside safely. We went back to the campsite, hoping to see the wolves, but they had moved on and we did not hear them again, so I let my dog sleep in the tent with me. We were fairly certain we had narrowly avoided having to defend ourselves against a pack of wolves, and I slept that night with my tomahawk and a flare gun right beside me. Story 24. Growing up, my parents were in the United States Navy, and when I was 8 or 9 years old, we moved to Flower Bluff Naval Air Station outside of Corpus Christi, Texas. From the very beginning, my older brother and I hated the place, constantly feeling like we were being watched. There were strange noises and unexplained smells, and we often heard what sounded like people talking, not loud enough to understand words, but clear enough to recognize voices. We shared a room for a while, and at night there was a constant tapping sound that reacted when we yelled at it to stop. Sometimes it would stop, other times it would grow more intense, almost as if it were mocking us. It frightened my usually brave older brother so badly that he would go sleep in our parents' room, while I was often too paralyzed with fear to move, and would lie there pretending to sleep even when he urged me to leave with him. We saw moving shadows, and on 2 very clear occasions, I saw full, shadowy figures. Objects would be moved or misplaced, something even our parents noticed and blamed on us. I am fairly sure my parents experienced things as well, but dismissed them or avoided discussing them so as not to frighten us. The house was haunted, plain and simple. One summer, I visited my grandparents in Florida and felt immediate relief being away. I later had a long conversation with my mother, telling her I thought I might be paranoid or mentally unwell, which finally made her take our experiences seriously. My father still dismissed it as imagination fueled by scary movies. Eventually, my brother became a teenager and needed his own room, so I moved into what had been the computer and office room. We had a dog named Sally, who became my constant companion and source of comfort. She stayed close at all times, slept on my bed, waited outside the bathroom, and on several occasions growled at the closet, the window, or the corner across from my bed. I truly believe she protected me from something angry, possibly something far worse, and without her, I might have lost my sanity. One night she woke me up shaking, ears back and whining, desperate to hide under my blanket, and whatever frightened her terrified me as well. Later that same night I woke to chaos, the window slamming shut behind my bed, the old computer turning on by itself, and the keyboard typing random characters even though it required manual commands to operate. I screamed for my parents. My father rushed in, saw the screen, heard the typing, and shut off the power. But as it went dark, there was a horrifying sound, like a choking groan filled with water that I can still hear in my memory. Days later, naval officers visited, including a child psychologist and a chaplain. And after speaking with us, my family was moved to a hotel and never returned to that house. The Navy later granted off-base housing, something extremely rare. And years afterward, my brother and I learned the area had been devastated by a massive hurricane in the early 1900s, with enormous loss of life. I believe that final sound I heard was something left behind from that tragedy, and even now remembering it sends chills through me. Story 25. This is not nearly as intense as many other stories, but it is one of the creepiest things that ever happened to me in what has otherwise been a fairly ordinary life. I grew up in extremely rural Texas, with our nearest neighbors several miles away, in a driveway that stretched for about half a mile. Our house sat on one of the only hills in the area, making it visible from very far away, even at night when the lights were on. At the time this happened, I was around 9 or 10 years old, and my sister, who was babysitting me, was about 16 or 17. My parents were attending a work event in the city roughly an hour away, and my sister picked me up from school around 6 in the evening after a basketball tournament. Since it was winter, it was already completely dark outside. We turned onto the driveway without any issues, but about halfway up, my sister suddenly slowed down. That made me look up, and I saw a man walking directly down the middle of the driveway toward our house. The driveway led nowhere else but straight to our home. He did not turn around or acknowledge us at all. Without saying a word, we both understood there was no chance we were going to speak to him. Not thinking clearly, my sister swerved around him, and we drove straight to the house, ran inside, and locked all the doors. Like characters in a horror movie, we then went upstairs and watched from the balcony while calling our parents. They left their event immediately, but at the time they did not have mobile phones. So my sister and I stayed huddled together, watching the porch light, waiting for someone to emerge from the darkness. My parents never saw the man on the driveway, and we never saw him approach the house or appear again. The unsettling part is that we lived on more than 600 acres of land, full of creeks, trees, and countless places someone could easily hide or even live if they were resourceful. I had always loved playing outside as a child, but after that night, I was rarely allowed to wander the property alone. It might not have bothered me as much since we occasionally had lost drivers come up the driveway looking for directions, but if that were the case, why did he never turn around, never look at us, and never make it to the house at all? Story 26. One night during my freshman year of high school, I had a band concert at school. Afterward, I walked to the car with my mom when a friend asked for a ride home, since he lived only about a block away. We were driving and chatting when I noticed something strange in the street ahead. It looked like someone standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. I pointed it out, and my mom said there was no way it was a person just standing there. The street was dimly lit and it was dark, so none of us were sure what we were seeing. As my mom slowed down, we realized it really was a man standing directly in the road, facing us and staring straight ahead. My mom carefully drove around him, and he did not move at all, not even an inch. We dropped my friend off while I called emergency services, then drove back home, which meant taking the same road again. Only about 5 minutes had passed, and we were terrified that he would still be there, possibly with other people. When we reached the spot again, he was gone without a trace. We arrived home shortly after and never heard anything else about the incident. I still do not know if he was suicidal, playing a dangerous game, or dared by friends. But even now, thinking about it sends chills through me. Story 27. My mother was diagnosed with cancer during the summer after I finished high school, and everything progressed incredibly fast. About a week after she was hospitalized, doctors told us it was cancer, that the prognosis was not good, but that they would try an experimental treatment. She promised me she would fight. A week later, still in shock, she told us she did not want us to spend that Friday night at the hospital, insisting that we should rest and have a small party to enjoy ourselves. Possibly because she needed time alone too. This was during the dial-up internet era, and during the gathering I stayed connected to download music. Sometime between midnight and 1 in the morning, a friend and I walked another friend to the bus stop, and suddenly I collapsed on the sidewalk with intense chest pain that felt like a heart attack. It was the worst pain I had ever experienced. Eventually, I caught my breath, blamed it on the heat, and returned home. Around 2:30 in the morning, my aunt and uncle arrived, and from my uncle's expression, I immediately knew my mother had passed away. The hospital had tried calling us, but the phone line was busy because of the internet connection, so they contacted my aunt and uncle instead. My mother had not started chemotherapy yet and was being treated with strong pain medication, which caused a blood clot to form. Sometime between midnight and 1, she got up to use the bathroom. The clot dislodged, and she suffered a stroke. She was found on the floor about an hour later during routine rounds. To this day, our family believes the chest pain I experienced and my mother's stroke were somehow connected. Related to this, when I was 2 years old, I was hospitalized with a severe kidney infection. One night, my mother had a nightmare of being chased through a house by a massive ball of fire. She woke up and immediately called the hospital, begging them to check on me. At first, the nurses reassured her, assuming she was just anxious, but she insisted. When they checked, they discovered my intravenous catheter had become dislodged during sleep, causing fluid to leak into surrounding tissue. The next day, they told her how lucky I was and how remarkable her intuition had been. Story 28. There was a time when I stayed at my uncle's place for a while because I was not on good terms with my stepfather, and it was the only option I could afford at the time. My uncle lived in what I can only describe as a very poor and extremely rough part of town. There were only two roads leading to his place, one being the long way back into town and the other being the straight shot, which passed a supermarket on the edge of town, then crossed a short bridge of about 150 feet, followed by a very long, very poorly lit stretch of road that ran for roughly 3 miles to my uncle's house. When I first arrived, we were driving over that bridge, and my uncle warned me to be careful there at night because people struggling with addiction often stayed underneath it. I did not think much of it at the time. About a month later, I was working at a restaurant in town and had to skateboard to and from work because I did not have a car. One night after work, sometime around midnight, I urgently needed to use the restroom, and the only place still open was that supermarket near the bridge. After finishing there, I started skating across the old wooden bridge and became very aware of how loud the rattling sounded beneath my board. That was when it hit me that I was on the bridge my uncle had warned me about, so I picked up my board and started walking quietly instead. The road was extremely dark, with streetlights spaced far apart. I had gone a little past the bridge when I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man wearing a distinctive windbreaker standing under the last light I had passed, about 50 yards behind me. When he noticed me looking back, he paused awkwardly and pretended to look around as if we were not the only two people on that long, empty road, then locked his gaze back onto me. Something about his posture immediately felt wrong. I kept walking, then picked up my pace, and when I checked again, he was much closer. I started running, knowing there was an intersection ahead less than a quarter mile away, but realizing I probably would not make it. I veered off the road into brush, jumped a fence, and ran through a ranch property, frightening horses as I went, before hopping another fence and hiding in a bush near a driveway. My only plan was to defend myself with my skateboard if I had to. At that moment, the property owner arrived home in his pickup truck and began yelling at me, demanding to know why I was hiding on his land. As I tried to explain that I was being followed, I saw the silhouette of the man on the other side of the bushes, slowly backing away. We made eye contact as he retreated, clearly having heard everything. The property owner saw him as well and stayed with me for a short time, but he refused to give me a ride. I eventually made it back to my uncle's place, shaken by the entire experience. Story 29. This is not necessarily paranormal, but it is one of the most chilling things that ever happened to my family when my siblings and I were children. We lived in a very rough area, a council estate in England, where the houses were built extremely close together with only narrow walkways between them. The walls were so thin that you could hear almost everything happening next door. Our neighbor, John, was a single parent who frequently had different men coming and going, but one of them stuck around and turned out to be a major drug dealer in the area. He hosted loud drug parties at her house that would start in the late afternoon and continue until early morning, often ending just as we were getting ready for school. One night, the noise became especially intense, with shouting and music loud enough to wake me, though I eventually fell back asleep. Sometime later, I woke up again and heard a knock at our front door and my mum answering it, but I did not think much of it and went back to sleep. Nothing was said about that night until years later, when my mum finally told me what had really happened. Earlier that evening, she had gone next door and asked one of the partygoers to keep the noise down because it was a school night. The man agreed and she returned home. The knock we heard later was John's boyfriend, who had come to our door holding a knife. He pressed it to my mum's throat and threatened that if she ever complained again or interfered with their parties, he would kill her in front of us, who were 7, 5, and 3 years old at the time. We moved 2 months later after a fire broke out in John's kitchen and nearly spread into our house. Even now, thinking about someone holding my mum at knife point makes my blood run cold and my stomach drop, and I cried uncontrollably when she finally told me the truth years later. Story 30. My brother was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia about 12 years ago, and he still lives with my parents because he cannot hold a job or continue his education due to the constant voices and visions in his head. He refuses to stay on his medication long enough for it to be effective, and instead chooses to self-medicate with substances and alcohol. I knew things at home were difficult, but I did not realize how bad they truly were until one Christmas a few years ago. I went home for the holidays and planned to sleep on the couch in the living room, and everything was fine during Christmas Eve until around 10 in the evening, when my brother could no longer contain himself. From his room in the basement came a non-stop stream of vile and disturbing words, mixed with loud, erratic laughter that was both boisterous and terrifying, echoing through the house at random intervals all night long and preventing me from sleeping at all. For months afterward, I struggled to sleep, and when I did, I had recurring nightmares of my brother harming my parents. He had never been violent before his diagnosis, but the things I heard that night and over the years since have filled me with constant fear for their safety. And even now, I still have nightmares about him. As things stand, the only alternative would be forcing my brother out to live on the streets, which my parents cannot bring themselves to do. Now, when I visit for the holidays, I stay in a hotel nearby so I do not have to relive that night, though it still weighs heavily on me, knowing my parents deal with it every day. Story 31. My neighbor was run over by a van while her husband was driving, and it happened in their front driveway, which formed a narrow tunnel between the house I lived in and the house they rented. At the end of the tunnel was a large sliding gate that opened into a small carport in their backyard. It was around 8 or 9 at night when we suddenly heard an incredibly loud, thunderous noise, followed immediately by horrifying screams. The kind of screams you only hear in movies when someone is dying. Then there was a long scraping sound along the side of our house, ending with a massive crash like a generic car accident sound. From what we later learned, the couple had been arguing because they were behind on rent and facing eviction, and the woman tried to jump out of the van while her husband was reversing out of the carport. Somehow she ended up on the ground in the middle of the tunnel, possibly crushed between the van and the wall, and the husband continued reversing, eventually slamming into a tree and bending the gate in half while damaging the siding on our house. My mom's friend was visiting at the time and ran next door along with everyone else. The husband was lying over his wife in a strange way, as if trying to protect her, while also pinning her down, whispering to her while she screamed in agony. Neighbors gathered in the yard, and I have never heard screams like that before or since, and I still remember how terrifying it was to witness. Story 32. I used to go running along the river dike in my town, which is a rural area where seeing deer is normal, and I preferred running at night because it was cooler, even though there were no streetlights. Almost every night I felt an ominous sensation like I was being watched, and I would stop, shine my flashlight around, see nothing, and keep going. After a few weeks, I mentioned this feeling to my friend Barkley, who lives deep in the mountains, and his face went pale as he grabbed me and told me I was probably being stalked by a mountain lion and should never run there alone at night. After that, I avoided the more remote section and stuck to the area where the dike passed through the city park. But one night while running, I felt that same sensation again and turned around to see a white figure extremely close behind me, close enough that it felt dangerously near. I ran as fast as I could through the park all the way to the hospital, where I finally felt somewhat safe. Another unsettling story comes from my father, who served in the Coast Guard on several very old ships, some dating back to the Second World War. He told me that sometimes during meals there would be crewmen present wearing incorrect uniforms, and later no one could find them. On another occasion, he encountered a confused crewman out of uniform, staring at a duty roster, who asked what ship they were on, and then walked away after hearing the answer. When my father asked around, he learned others had experienced the same thing, and records later showed that the uniforms matched sailors who had died aboard that ship during the war, leaving everyone unsettled by what they had seen. Story 33. Father's Day 2 years ago, after dropping my son off, I was driving home and came up behind a clearly impaired driver swerving between lanes. I could not pass, and the light ahead was turning red, so I slowed down to see which lane they chose and planned to pass when it changed. The passenger, who I later learned was the husband, started shouting out the window, yelling that I needed to learn how to drive and that I was making his wife nervous because she only had a permit. I ignored him and continued on. At the next red light, they pulled in behind me, slowed down a short distance back, then sped up like they were going to ram me, stopping just a couple of feet short. I could hear the man yelling. The light changed and we continued, and at the following red light, they did the same thing again, slowing down, then accelerating hard before stopping. This time I saw a shadow move through my headlights in the rearview mirror, and seconds later, I heard him shout outside my open window as the rear driver's side window shattered just centimeters from the back of my head. The man was swinging a tire iron and pulling back to strike me. I was the first car at the light. The left lane was full, so I threw my truck into gear and turned sharply to the right, hoping I would not be hit by another vehicle. I managed to get through and loop back through the turn lane to follow them. As the man went back to his vehicle, he dropped the tire iron. The light had turned green, but no one else moved. I could have run him over or rammed their vehicle, but I chose to follow instead. I called emergency services while following them at about 25 miles per hour, which was also the route I normally took home. The operator told me not to follow, but stayed on the line and said officers were ahead. When I saw the police up the road, I flashed my headlights, and the vehicle pulled over, thinking I was law enforcement. Other officers immediately surrounded them and had to wrestle the man to the ground as he tried to swallow something. Then a baby started crying from the back seat. A witness retrieved the tire iron and gave it to police as evidence. The woman was charged with driving under the influence, operating without a license, and endangering a child, and the man was charged with possession, assault, and endangering a child. If my headrest had not been where it was, I would have been struck in the head. I hate that road so much that I now take a 25-minute detour 4 times a week just to avoid it. Story 34. My father was a violent criminal, though I did not know that when I was young. To me, he was just Daddy, my hero, the man who protected me from nightmares and taught me things. Sometimes he got angry and hurt me, or pulled my hair, and he thought it was funny to scare me with things like dead spiders. I believed this was normal, that fathers disciplined and teased their children, and that he loved me. I thought I was his little princess. I did not know the man I admired was actually dangerous. Everything changed one night when my little brother and I woke up to a woman screaming. I was 8 and my brother was 7. It was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. We heard her begging for her life, my father shouting in rage, and the unmistakable sounds of violence. I did not understand everything, only that my father was doing something horrible. The man I believed he was would never hurt someone unless they threatened us. And when I realized he was the one causing harm, my entire world collapsed. I did not know what would happen if he came for us, only that I had to protect my brother. My father heard us crying and burst into the room, screaming at us while I held my brother as tightly as I could. He left us unharmed and went back to hurting the woman. I rocked my brother, telling him everything would be okay, even though I did not believe it myself. Then we heard a gunshot, and in the silence that followed, we thought the woman had been killed. When she screamed again, I felt relief because it meant she was still alive. I do not know how long we sat there listening, terrified that we would be next, but it felt endless. Eventually, my father moved her away and then left. Later, we learned he had restrained her and chained her in a doghouse. Sometime after that, police arrived and took us away. It has been 16 years and I still have nightmares of that woman screaming.